Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the 16th chapter in the book of Proverbs, and we have a lot to cover here, so we're going to avoid our customarily lengthier preamble and just keep it to the bare essentials. And Proverbs is a literary device which is a pithy saying of condensed wisdom, and every culture has their own version of them. But what makes the Hebrews distinct is that theirs are inspired, that is to say, divinely so. So they are not reflective of human wisdom, but are inspired by divinity and communicated through the mouth of man to man. So the opening verse reads, "To man belongs the preparations of the heart, but from Yahweh is the answer of the tongue." Now, most translations translate preparation as plans, or at least a few others do, but this statement ought not be interpreted as suggesting that Yahweh does not wish for us to make intelligent decisions or exercise our brain power. It is only to say to give him the full and final say on our plans, and he will provide us with the answer on our tongues. Now, in the New Testament, we read that the Savior instructs the apostles to take no premeditation when they're brought before the Gentiles to answer for their faith, and they have his assurance that the Ruach Kadesh will guide them with what they need to say. "All the ways of the man are clean in his own eyes, but Yahweh weighs the spirit." This concept is reiterated in Proverbs 21:2, and the weighing of the spirit is also referenced in 1 Samuel 16:7. And so man looks at the eyes or the outer appearance, but Yahweh judges the heart, and that's because he is able to penetrate the invisible essence and qualities of our innermost secrets and is able to dissect the heart, and that is how he judges us. And there is a way that to man that seems right, but the end of that way is death in Proverbs 14:12. And even though I paraphrase that verse, I believe it is repeated verbatim in one other place in the book of Proverbs. "Commit your works to Yahweh, and your plan shall be established." Therein we learn that the establishment of our plans are predicated on our faith and trust and submission to Yahweh. So we have no reason or expectation to expect them to succeed in the absence of his direction, and we are to seek his counsel and his will in all ways and in all things. "Yahweh has made all for his purpose, and also the wicked for the day of evil." Now, everything in the grand design of creative and redemptive history is created for a wider purpose, which is invisible to most, but the student of the Bible is privy to not every detail, but the generality of the plan. And the wicked are very much part of that plan, and they are allowed to be created to their destiny is, of course, hell, but Isaiah 45:7 reads that Yahweh creates light and dark and the good and the wicked, and creates good and evil, and he's the author thereof. So that means that that is all according to his wise design, though we may not be able to immediately discern it or detect it. They are in fact made for a wiser purpose than we can often immediately grasp. "Everyone proud in heart is an abomination to Yahweh. Hand to hand, he does not go unpunished." Now, with good reason does C.S. Lewis identify pride as the vice which leads to every other vice, and this brings us to the original sin, which was not committed by Adam and Eve. They were taught and compelled and beguiled to sin by the adversary, who is the original rebel, but his rebellion against Yahweh was rooted in the condition of the heart, which was pride. He was the angel of preeminent physical magnificence and intellectual capabilities, and he was the nearest to Elohim out of all created creatures, but that wasn't enough of him. He wanted to usurp Elohim's rightful place on the throne, and he since then has become the author and purveyor of all that is evil. "By kindness and truth wickedness is pardoned, and in the reverence of Yahweh one turns away from evil." So the antidote to wickedness, the most effective deterrence, is mercy, which is another version's translation, and truth. So we cannot pardon wickedness without mercy, and we are commanded to forgive, and forgiveness is much too precious a commodity to be wasted on the unforgiven. We read in Matthew 6:12 and 14. And the fear of Yahweh is the fear, it's translated as reverence in this version, but it is the fear which expels all other fears. And one who does not have that fear instilled and ingrained in them will not be afraid of the consequences of their evil actions, because they will not harbor and exist a concept of an Elohim who judges them for their actions and who holds them to account. When a man's ways please Yahweh, he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. Now, the general juxt of Proverbs are not promises, but principles. So the principle espoused in this verse is that if we are aligned and right with Elohim or Yahweh, then we will be aligned and right with even our enemies. And the one who is so submitted to Yahweh will cause no offense or injury to anyone else, and they can be all but assured of, by principle, of being in having no confrontation or anything of that nature with their enemies. Now, to be clear, this is not a universal prescription, as I mentioned earlier. Very often the peacemakers, even though we are commanded to be peacemakers in Matthew 5:9, we often are at war with the world, because the world has a radically different values and outlooks than the ones we espouse, and and the war is at war with Elohim, who is trying to reconcile his enemies unto himself. He loved and died for us, even though we were his enemies, in Romans 5:6-8 or somewhere thereabouts. Better is a little with righteousness than large income without justice. Now, Solomon was, without exaggeration, one of the wealthiest individuals who ever lived in human history, but he did not lose sight of the priority that cultivating righteousness was more important and significant than accumulating wealth, and he would rather have a little and be righteous than to attain and acquire his income, wealth, and riches without justice. And that is a palpable temptation for most people in positions of authority, such as was he, but for the most part he was submitted to his calling and promise. A man's heart plans his ways, but Yahweh establishes his steps. So this brings us back to verse 1 and 3 and a few other places throughout the book of Proverbs. Yahweh wants us to exercise our intelligence and the discernment he gave us, but we are to to submit our plans and express them to him and seek out his will and his direction and his counsel and give him the full and final say. So our priorities are not to be our plans, which are formulated in accordance to our own personal inclinations and desires, but we are to, above all else, seek the will of Yahweh. An oath is on the lips of the king. In justice his mouth trespasses not. Now, to be clear, this is a picture of an ideal king, and Solomon was very much the prototype of such. He will speak truth and lie not, and rule honestly and speak honestly. A right scale and balances are of Yahweh. All the weights in the bag are his works. Now, much of the book of Proverbs and many of the prophets of the Old Testament repudiate the sin of dishonest balances, that is, which gives the customer dishonest measurements, which are not at all accurate, and therefore shortchange them according to the sum of money in the amount they exchange and agree upon. So that is very much identified as a sin, and it is rooted in covetousness, which is the 10th and final commandment of the Decalogue. It is an abomination for kings to commit wickedness, for a throne is established by righteousness. Now, the sad fact of history is the majority of kings are purveyors of wickedness and evil, but a throne is ideally established in righteousness, and this was very much the case with his father David, who was identified as implicitly as a man after Elohim's own heart in 1 Samuel 3 13:14, and more explicitly in Acts 13:22. And Solomon, towards the end of his life, he departed from the way of righteousness and allowed his numerous foreign wives to set up their idolatrous artifices within Jerusalem, and this resulted in the splintering of the united monarchy, which henceforth would be divided into two kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel to the north and the kingdom of Judah to the south. And the northern kingdom of Israel was not founded in righteousness. Jeroboam was an able administrator under Solomon's jurisdiction who eventually rose up resentment and had to flee to Egypt while Solomon was still living. But one of the prophets, whose name escapes me, proclaimed to him that he would return and splinter the kingdom and rule the northern kingdom. Sadly, every single monarch of Israel was an idolater and wicked and did not walk into the ways of Yahweh, whereas those of Judah were more or less evenly divided. So the common, although not universal, pattern was for an idolater to be succeeded and preceded by a reformer. Righteous lips are the delight of kings, and they love him who speaks what is straight. Now, Solomon is clearly referencing himself and not the average or typical or not a universally prescriptive description of the ruler or the king, because but he very much delighted in truth. He devoted his life to the accumulation of truth and righteousness lips. That means no dishonest words or intentions or anything of that sort, and that is a source of pleasure to him. That was. The king's wrath is an angel of death, but a wise man appeases it. So rulers vested with absolute authority had the power and the ability to act on their wrath if so inclined, and it's compared to an angel of death in that it often does result in death or imprisonment or something painful or punishment. But the prudent approach is to appease it, that is to work with it and not to exacerbate it by responding to a wrathful outbreak with a wrathful response. That is very much the way of wisdom to deal with such matters. In the light of a king's face is life, and his delight is like a cloud of the rain. So he compares his own face to light of life, and light is synonymous with truth and goodness throughout the scriptures, and life is the precious thing that the natural man values above all else, but the saints who walk on the straight and narrow value their eternal life and not so much this one on earth, and many of them are in fact willing to die and suffer persecution, even though it may not immediately improve their life and may in fact end it. How much better is it to get wisdom than gold, and to get understanding is preferable to silver. So this parallels a verse we earlier read, that being verse 8, which reiterates much the same contents, or same concept rather, because the lesson which is communicated in both is that it's not worth it to be wealthy if you perjure or damage your immortal soul. But if you do, it's an overly simplistic notion that the wealthy man is unable to be saved. And this brings us to the New Testament, when the Savior declares that what is impossible with man is very much possible with Yahweh. The highway of the straight is to turn away from evil. He who guards his life watches over his way. Now, the way we are commanded to follow is the way that is personified and embodied by the one who identified himself as the way, the truth, and the life in John 14:6. And the way is straight and narrow, and broad is the way, the path to destruction in Matthew 7:15. The narrow way, now broad, is the way of temptation and sin and succumbing thereto. But the one who walks on the straight and narrow will eschew evil and not indulge in the temptation to partake in it. Before destruction, pride, and before a fall, a haughty spirit. Now, this is one of the verses in the Bible which is more easily recited than applied, but the principle is clear. Like I said earlier, pride is identified by C.S. Lewis as the vice which leads to all other vices, and rightly so, and it ultimately led to, as we witness in Lucifer, his destruction, which has yet to unfold, but he is marked for the lake of fire, and as the old adage goes, misery enjoys company, so he knows he's doomed, but he wants to tempt and ensnare as many down that dreaded destiny as he is able, and that is his perpetual mission and ministry. And he fell from heaven because of his haughty spirit, and he visits the earth, and he's not in hell yet, but that is his ultimate destiny. Better to be lowly in spirit with the poor than to divide the spoil with the proud. So once more, this reiterates much the same concept as the 8th and 16th verses, which express the superiority of wealth, or the superiority of righteousness to wealth ill-gotten gain. But poor, it's superior to be poor and humble, or lowly and have humility, and to divide the spoil with the proud. Pride is a contagious emotion, and it rubs off amongst those who express it in proximity to the people who are in proximity to those who express it. He who acts wisely concerning the word finds good, and blessed is he who trusts in Yahweh. This is a self-evident statement. The word is a wellspring and source of good, and it gives us the guidelines on how to act and how to think and how to believe, and we are instructed and admonished to do so with wisdom and prudence, and blessed trust in Yahweh. Now, there are a lot of realities and circumstances in life, often unpredictable, which can compel one so afflicted to lose sight of Yahweh's love and to forsake the trust in him, but he is very much in control, and he often uses pain to bring us closer to him. The wise-hearted is called discerning, and sweetness of lips increases learning. Now, discerning is more or less synonymous with discrimination, and one of the tragedies of our post-modern mindset is that we are conditioned to think of discrimination as in exclusively viceful terms, but discernment is very much the prudent, cautious, and good exercise of discrimination, which compels the one who exercises it to eschew what is evil and to embrace what is good. And sweetness of lips increases learning. Now, we learn in order to share what we learn with our lips. So the end of attaining knowledge is not in itself, but in sharing it and expressing it and teaching it. Understanding is a fountain of life to him who has it, but the disciplining of fools is folly. So understanding is a fountain of life to those who have it, and that is understanding not only unlocks the meaning of life for oneself, but the wider and broader purpose of why Elohim gave us life. And the disciplining of fools is folly. It may seem like that to him. He expresses this concept all throughout the book of Proverbs in that it's... fools do not embrace discipline, and but discipline lovingly administered is very much a corrective and remedial value, has a corrective and remedial value. The heart of the wise gives discretion to the mouth, and he increases learning to his lips. So one of the frequent concepts throughout Proverbs in the book of Ecclesiastes 10:1-3, springs immediately to mind, and Proverbs 12:23 is one of the original expressions of this concept, that wisdom by its very nature does not need to express itself in a self-aggrandizing or a self-serving manner. They are content to know that they are wise, and they are almost indifferent to whether anyone else knows it. But the heart of the foolish proclaimeth foolishness. That means that in Proverbs 12:23, that means foolishness by its very nature is self-aggrandizing and seeks its own attention. Little does the fool know that he is only expressing to others exactly how foolish he is. Pleasant words are like a honeycomb, sweet to the being and healing to the bones. So pleasant words, as opposed to destructive or demeaning or degrading words, are very much a source of pleasure, comparable to the sweetness of a honeycomb. And it can heal the bones. That means it has a remedial quality and a redemptive quality. There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. Now, I earlier mentioned this, unbeknownst to me, that in this very chapter, the concept would repeat verbatim that which is expressed in Proverbs 14:12. So the natural man, governed by his instincts and appetites and inclinations, will pursue what seems to be right to him, what seems to be best to him is that which serves his own immediate and selfish interest. But the end of the way is death. He who sin is identified as the source of death. And so by opposite inference, the straight and narrow is the way to life. And the one who submits to the will of the Almighty can attain that blessed abode eternally. He who labors for himself, for his mouth drives him on. Now, there is much that Solomon comments on the virtue of diligence, which is connected to prosperity. Now, to be clear, there are other ways one may attain prosperity by cleverness, trickery, or inheritance. But as a general principle, diligence leads to prosperity. And the Hebrews, under the Old Covenant, one of the conditions for their obedience was identified as prosperity and material prosperity in Deuteronomy 28, 1 through 14. And of course, the 15th through 68th verse explains the consequences and curses of their disobedience. And the disproportionate number is reflected not quite exactly in the 248 positive precepts of the Mosaic Law versus the 365 negatives, and the 17 vices of the vices of the Spirit versus the 9 fruits of the Spirit in Galatians 5. A man of Baal plots evil, and on his lips it is like a burning fire. Baal was one of the aboriginal indigenous Canaanites deities, and he was not a moral being. One, he was non-existent, but he did not provide his adherents any morally sound model for them to follow. And so the man who submits to him will be naturally inclined to scheme, conspire, and plot evil. And that's just the nature. We become like the nature of the one we worship, so we are to cling to what is good, and Elohim alone is strictly speaking good, that is to say, perfectly and purely good. A perverse man sends forth strife, and a slanderer separates intimate friends. These are the outcomes of the outlooks of perverse people. They live on contention and conflict. And slanderer, that means someone who traffics in gossip and innuendo and false claims and false and libelous statements, can only have the effect of dividing friends and intimate associations and causing consternation and conflict, which wasn't there before they took it upon themselves to slander at least one of them. A malicious man entices his neighbor and leads him in a way that is not good. This is, again, the nature of the malicious. They, as I've said before, the old adage that misery enjoys company compels the sinner to tempt the neutral person into following them into their path. And but the end is rarely good. The means to the end, it may seem pleasant in the immediate sense, and that it gratifies one's immediate gratification and seemingly serves their own self-interest, but it's a poor investment in the long run. Winking with his eyes to plot perversity, moving his lips, he shall bring about evil. Now, the plotting and conspiring and planning of perversity is very much the nature of the perverse, which feeds on its own, and those who embody the vice seek to sow and reap and spread it. And that's just that's testament to their natures and their every verbal claim is, or nearly every, is a source of evil. It is evil in its expression and evil in its intent, which is often designed to entice and ensnare those who hear it into the path of waywardness. And the consequences of following the wayward path is you will reap retribution. Gray here is a crown of adorning. It is found in the way of righteousness. Now, the Hebrews were commanded to have a special concern and respect for the elders among them. Now, every elderly person knows what it's like to be young, but no young person knows what it's like to be elderly. And from that more exhaustive vantage point, they are to be respected, and we also owe our lives to those who came before us. So it is a self-evident virtue that respect for elders, and this is the fifth commandment, the first of the six righteous ones, and rightly so. And Solomon comments on this virtue throughout the book of writings of Proverbs. He who is patient is better than the mighty, and he who rules over his spirit than he who takes a city. Now, the path of salvation, or the assurance thereof, is identified as enduring to the end in Matthew 24:13 and Luke 13, and Mark 13:13, and maybe somewhere in Luke 24 or 21. But so the aspect of patience means that we are to endure what comes our ways, the suffering, the persecution, the pain, the price of our salvation, and that is more ultimately of greater value and a source of greater strength than strength itself. And he who rules his spirit is this concept is repeated without Solomon's knowledge, but the Buddha said something much similar, and he came about 400 years after Solomon, and there is no communication from the Hebrew people on the Indian subcontinent at that historical context. The lot is cast into the lap, but every decision by it is from Yahweh. So casting lots was a pagan practice, and we witness on the boat, which was in the midst of a storm in Jonah, that the pagan sailors among it resorted to the practice, which is technically forbidden through Scripture, but Yahweh works through Gentiles to reveal his will and express his purpose, and sure enough, the casting of the lots pointed to Jonah, who they identified as the source of their woes. But once again, every decision by it is from Yahweh, so that means we are to submit our own plans and decisions with a mindfulness towards Yahweh, who alone knows what's best for us. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. Tune in next time. Bye-bye.